Let's open this Bible study today with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your grace and for your mercy. Lord, I'm asking that you anoint this Bible study as you always do. Send your Spirit into this house. Direct this study as you would see fit. Open us up to your word, and we ask that Jesus Christ be glorified in this place. And we ask it all in his name. Amen. Amen. Y'all can go ahead and join me at 1 Samuel chapter 25. It's a long chapter, and at first, to some, 1 Samuel 25 might look like a disruption to the plot of this book. But it does have its place, for one very specific reason that we'll look at tonight, obviously. But find 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1. When you get there, you can go ahead and stand for the reading of God's Word. Amen. 1 Samuel 25, verse 1. And Samuel died, and all of the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him, and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. You may be seated. Last week we looked at in chapter 24 where David had an opportunity to kill the man who's been giving him most of his trouble so far in this book, Saul. Saul was continuing his crusade against David, his manhunt for David. And David had the golden opportunity to put this to rest once and for all. But he doesn't do that. He says, and these are his words, that he will not put his hand on the Lord's anointed. And basically what happens is David directly confronts Saul towards the end of the last chapter, calls him out for this foolishness that he's been caught up in, and swears to Saul that this whole dilemma between these two men, David has now placed it completely in God's hands. Now that doesn't mean that David wasn't trusting God over this before, but in declaring to Saul about this matter, David is making it known that to Saul that David has basically put Saul on God's shoulders. David is not accepting Saul as his problem, even though in the future David will say a thing or two that kind of call that statement of faith into question, to be honest. But as of now, David has made it known that he is trusting God for Saul. If Saul wants to stop this, that's his decision. If God has to stop this, then so be it. This is between God and Saul now. And at the end of the chapter, Saul gets all teary-eyed, and he basically repents to David there in this moment, and he acknowledges David as the more righteous man between these two, and he acknowledges how David will be the king of Israel one day. He acknowledges all of these things that are true. And then it says that Saul takes all of his men to go back. And there for a moment, Saul ceases his manhunt against David. But David, at least the way that these events play out, David, we're led to believe, does not trust Saul on his word. And Saul has shown himself at this point to be a very aggressive man, at times a very unpredictable man, a very bloodthirsty man even. So, for obvious reasons, even if somebody says, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again, if they have a very colorful past showing just how bad they can be, I don't think I would have trusted Saul either in this situation. And just because somebody does audibly repent to you, that just doesn't always mean that they're really done trying to hurt you. That's just the truth. They could even get teary-eyed. I'm sure we've all seen this in our lifetimes. Whenever somebody is either having to face consequences for their actions, it could be your child, it could be your parent, it could be your friend, and whenever they are confronted with what they're illing, everyone else with. They even get teary-eyed and they say, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again, but they just keep repeating the same thing over and over. It's a very bitter taste of this side of eternity, unfortunately. And I wouldn't trust Saul in this situation either. So David and his men, it says at the end of chapter 24, they remain in the hole. In other words, the cave that they were living in, and in hiding. They remain there. And chapter 25 opens up by announcing the death of the prophet Samuel. And this might seem abrupt, but this is just how these events played out. It was sometime after David and Saul's last encounter from chapter 24, where Samuel, who even by the beginning of this book was already labeled as an old man, Samuel dies at the beginning of chapter 25. We're led to believe that his death is completely natural. At the beginning of 1 Samuel, and I say at the beginning, really in those first few chapters of 1 Samuel, when Samuel grows up into a man, by that point we don't even know if David had been born at the beginning of all of this. So Samuel, by the time they had their first king, was already an old man, and time has gone on since that day to this point. And we're led to believe that Samuel died of purely natural causes, and he has gone to be with the Master, or he has gone to be in paradise. And there is such a bitter sweetness to the death of a saint, let me tell you. It's bitter because obviously this was somebody who had a serious impact on Israel. The Bible tells us in that first verse is that the Israelites gathered together and they lamented over him. And that might, to some, make them all look like a bunch of hypocrites at first, because the last time you see really Samuel communicating with all of Israel, they're politely begging him to step down from that leadership position. But how often have we had a death in the family, and even though there were times in the past where you had your moments with that individual, whenever they die, all you can think about are the good things. All you can think about are the times where you two shared in laughter and in joy. So even if Samuel and Israel had a, at times, complicated past, the Israelites, whenever Samuel passes away, they're reminded of how God has used this great man all those years ago to call them out of idolatry. If you've ever read through the book of Judges, you know how before the prophet Samuel was risen to that position by God, how the Israelites were in this constant spiritual circle of depravity and oppression, and God would deliver them from the oppressors, but the whole cycle would repeat over and over. It went on for over 200 years. And during Samuel's ministry, they saw that cycle break. At least for the time being, it looked like once and for all. That cycle of constant oppression and suffering from a foreigner, from a foreign nation, who would bring in their false gods and feed you this false faith and these false religions. All of that broke under the ministry of the prophet Samuel. In a sense, the book of Judges does have a happy ending. It just comes a few chapters later after the book of Judges is over. Because that era did stop. And it's because of Samuel's faithfulness to God and because of his faithfulness to Israel. Because for a long time, it would be easy to give up on a people like the Israelites. It would have been easy for Moses to give up on them during the wilderness journey. It would have been easy for some of these judges to give up on Israel, especially in times when it looked like nobody was willing to help the deliverer who God raised up. And here is Samuel. He's not a warrior. He's not a military leader like Samson and Gideon and Deborah. He is just a prophet, and he's nothing more than a prophet. He has held a sword once as in his entire life that we know of. He's not a fighter, but he is a man of God. And God would use this one man to drag them out of this cycle of confusion. And they would maintain this consistent closeness with the Lord for a long time because of this man. So when he dies, the people of Israel unanimously lament over him. And because Saul and David were at peace during this time, it is likely that David would have had the opportunity to attend Samuel's funeral as well. The Bible doesn't say that, but they were at peace. But David still doesn't trust the circumstance. And David is still in hiding. But you have to understand that David is the, I'm going to say, unofficial leader of these 600 men. I say unofficial because it's not like anybody has crowned him. It's not like anybody has publicly declared in front of the assembly, David is our leader and we shall look to him. There's just this bond between David and these soldiers, this bond of trust and brotherhood between him and his 600 mighty men. But as an unofficial leader, David has to provide for these men who left Israel in debt, who left their homes in Israel distressed, and he has to care for these men, and they need work. 1 Samuel 25, and I mentioned this a minute ago, might look at first like a departure from the narrative that's been happening in this book so far. Because at this point, if you look at the book just through a narrative perspective, it's a book about David escaping Saul. That's really the gist of 1 Samuel, and God delivering David from Saul's wrath. And that is the gist of it. And then you get to chapter 25, and if this were a TV show, and each chapter in this book was its own episode, you would call chapter 25 a filler episode. A filler episode is that episode, and if you've ever been booked with a TV show, you have seen this kind of episode before. It is the episode where things do happen, the characters are there, but it just doesn't seem like the overall plot is going anywhere. On the surface of things, it looks like in this filler episode, really I'm just kind of wasting my time because nothing that important seems to be happening. It's a filler episode. And the whole purpose, the reason why they call it a filler episode is because the whole purpose of the episode is to fill time that the company has asked the writer to fill in for the amount of episodes that they wanted in that season. It's a filler episode. An episode where things do happen, but at the end of all of it, if you were to go back and rewatch the season, you honestly feel like you could just skip over that episode and you wouldn't have missed anything. Y'all know what I'm talking about? At first, it looks like 1 Samuel 25 is that kind of a chapter. Because the events that happen in this chapter don't seem to be that important in the grand scheme of things. But there is one detail that we learn in 1 Samuel 25 that I think is very important. There is something we learn about David in this chapter that the Bible doesn't just say outright. It doesn't just announce it to you. But there is something about David that this chapter does show us that is very, very important for you to catch. Because if you can catch what this chapter introduces to you about this man, there are going to be things that happen in the future that are going to make more sense. In verse 2 it says, "And there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel. And the man was very great, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of this man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail, and the name of and she was a woman of good understanding, and of a beautiful countenance. But the man was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb. And David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did shear his sheep." Now Nabal and his wife Abigail, these two and David, these three, are going to be who this entire chapter is going to be revolving around. All the stuff that happens is happening between these three people. Nabal, his wife Abigail, and David. And it's interesting, you need to keep this in mind. I think Nabal's name in Hebrew literally means foolish one, and you're going to need to remember that. The Bible doesn't use the modern terms that we would use to describe the relationship between Abigail and Nabal, but the truth of the matter is this. Nabal is the last thing that you would want in a spouse. We'll learn that he's an alcoholic, that he's a man of terrible character. All the while, you have Abigail, who is the exact opposite. She has a very sober mind. She's very intelligent. She's very quick-witted. And really, this is a relationship that you look at it and you're like, what are these two doing together? And even today, we see relationships like this, and you ask that question. But back in the day, you have to remember, it was very difficult for a woman to make her own living. It was very difficult for a woman to run her own business, keep her own job. A lot of marriages that took place back then were for very practical reasons and not so much romantic or emotional. A woman had to have a husband because that was the safest way for her to have some kind of fixed income coming into the home that she would be cared for. That's just the way that it was. So you have Nabal and Abigail, and David gets wind that Nabal is having his sheep sheared in Carmel. So David is interested in going to Nabal because Nabal is a powerful man and Nabal is a wealthy man. Let's look at verse 3. Let's look at verse 5. And David sent out 10 young men, and David said unto the young men, Get you up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus shall you say to him that lives in prosperity, Peace be both to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be unto all that you have. And now I have heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds which were with us, we hurt them not, neither was there aught missing unto them, all the while they were in Carmel. Ask the young men, and they will show you. And they will show you. There was a wasp crawling on my desk. I had to scare it off. Verse 8. Ask the young men, and they will show you. Wherefore let the young men find favor in your eyes, for we come in a good day. Give, I pray you, whatsoever comes to your hand unto your servants and to your son David. And when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all those words in the name of David, and ceased. You can't just live off the land when God has given you hands and feet to work with, and then just assume that God will provide your every need the same way that he provided for the Israelites in the wilderness with the manna. Paul would say in the New Testament, if you don't work, you don't eat. And it's a principle that is just true. I know that people like to talk about capitalism and how people can corrupt the system and all that jazz, but it's just the fact of life. There's nothing much deeper to these principles than what is said initially. If you don't work, you don't eat. If you are able to work, the right thing for you to do is to work. David is in charge of 600 men who don't have a job. So how would you like it if you were overseeing 600 men who were out of work and were branded traitors to the nation over a silly reason? So these men, they need something to do. They need some kind of income, because the fact is there's a difference between me just not being able to work and then God, by pure grace, supplying my every need, despite my inconvenience, despite whatever might beset me. There's a difference between that and somebody just using grace as an excuse to do nothing. Saying that because God can do anything, that I don't really need a job because God can give me whatever I need anyways. And it's a very cheap outlook on grace. And David does not have a cheap outlook on grace. As a matter of fact, I would argue, especially by the time he dies, David has a far grander view of the grace of God than anyone else, maybe in the Old Testament era. So David is inquiring of this wealthy man, who even if he pays these 600 men just a little bit each, can still pay these 600 men, if not with money, maybe with animals, maybe with food, something. And it says that these young men, they go to Nabal and they tell him everything that David said. In verse 9 it says, in verse 10 it says, "And Nabal answered David's servants and said, 'Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse?' There be many servants nowadays that break away every man from his master." That's a very odd thing to say. Who is this man David? A lot of people in Israel knew who David was. A lot of people knew who David was. And it's very difficult to believe that a man who owns such a big business, that no doubt has a lot of people working in that business, a man with so much wealth, so much power, a man who is without a doubt of the nobility, that he honestly doesn't know who David, the son of Jesse, is. A lot of people believe that Nabal is straight up lying in this verse right here. The Bible doesn't outright say in the verse that he's lying, but people have really thought about this. Because how in the world does a man among the nobility, how does he not know one of the most popular people? At least you've never heard of his name, David, the son of Jesse. I know they didn't have last names back in the day, but David, the son of Jesse, even if there was another David walking around, this is the son of Jesse that we're talking about. So it's like, how do you not know? Very odd moment. And then Nabal says after that, "There be many servants now, days that break away every man from his master." He's basically saying, how do I know that you people who are basically asking me for jobs, how do I know that you'll not just take, I guess, your first payment and then dart somewhere else? How do I know that you're not criminals? Yada, 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 yada. In verse 11, he continues saying, "Shall I then take my bread and my water and my flesh that I have killed for my shearers and give it unto men whom I know not whence they be?" Which honestly is kind of a good thing to point out. But it's still very weird that he has no idea who David, the son of Jesse, is. Let me ask you this question. Does anybody know, or have you at least heard his name before? Elon Musk. Does y'all know who that is? Even if you don't know what Elon Musk does, the man is so popular. You don't have to know what he does, what job he has, to have heard that name before. You don't have to even know who they are to recognize that name. And David, at this point in Israel, even if you don't know what he does, he's so popular. You've heard of this man at some point or another, surely. You would have to be hiding under a rock to not at least hear about this guy, David, the son of Jesse. Yeah, that is true. That is very true. Did y'all hear that? They didn't mention that David was the son of Jesse. Nabal appears to just kind of insert that in there when he asks, "Who is that?" So it's a very odd thing to say. And then, using that sense of logic, he then tries to make himself look like the good boss and say, "Should I give money and flesh that I've killed," talking about food, "that I've given to my servants? Do you expect me to just give that to all of these men? I don't even know where you came from. Is that what you're asking me to do in this situation?" And David's young men, they do the right thing because they're not really the ones who are in authority here. It says after he does this, after he says that to them, in verse 12 it simply says, "So David's young men turned their way, and went again, and came and told him all those sayings. And David said unto his men, Gird you on every man his sword. And they girt on every man his sword, and David also girded on his own sword. And there went up after David about 400 men and 200 of old by the stuff. This is what I want to really focus on right here. This is what I really want to focus on. Before this chapter, in the very last chapter, David met his biggest adversary, and he publicly declared to his adversary that he was going to trust the Lord with Saul. David was even put in a position where it would have been very easy to kill Saul himself, but he didn't do it because he did not want to take the life of the Lord's anointed, as he called Saul. He made it very clear that God is big enough to handle my enemies in his divine wisdom. Whenever David faced Goliath, what did David say before he killed the giant? What did he say to Saul before he went out? He said, the Lord will give this giant to me today. He goes out to Goliath, and he says one of the most famous things David said, you come to me with a spear and a sword and a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. So far, David has exhibited such a humility towards his enemies, even the enemy that he himself has killed. And then you get to chapter 25. David's young men are sent to just ask for a job. Nobody's life is on the line here. Nobody's about to die. Nobody is sick. And all they do is they come back and basically say that Nabal said no. And David's very first reaction is to call his army to get their swords out. And basically, we're going to go and kill Nabal if we have to. How do you go from this is the Lord's matter before it's mine to we got to kill this man right now? He's clearly a threat. How do you go from one point to another? Whenever we looked at Saul and the beginning of his spiritual downfall in this book, I referenced something to y'all that Brother Lauren Larson told us about back when I was in Bible college, how whenever somebody begins the process that will unfortunately end with them renouncing their faith and losing their salvation, it's not something that just happens overnight, but he described it as being the downward spiral. The idea isn't that somebody just does something bad and then they lose their salvation overnight. But what happens is that over a long period of time, the individual embraces more of the flesh, embraces more of the world, embraces more of the temptations of the devil, if you can put it like that. And over a period of time, they become so empty of the things of God and the ways of God to the point that they consciously just renounce the faith and they leave their status as a saved individual. Now, how often this actually happens, I have no idea. I'm not about to act like I know, and really I don't want to know, to be honest with you. But it's a downward spiral. It's not a steep drop. It is just something that happens over a period of time. I have seen this happen with people, unfortunately. I have seen people who knew the Bible, you would think like the back of their hand, were serious experts in the Greek language, and they could quote the New Testament to you the same way that they could quote a lullaby that they were sung when they were a child. And still, over a period of time, I've seen even those people lose the faith or give up the faith. I have seen it happen. It's really what is happening with Saul, unfortunately. And whenever a believer begins to, there's a fly on the microphone, whenever a believer begins to go down this road where they allow their flesh to determine who they are, and as they become ever more distant from the Lord, they are on that downward spiral journey. They're not at the bottom of the spiral, but they are on the spiral. And what you see in David's life right here, even though you could miss it very easily, is evidence that even David has now found himself on that very spiral. How even David is at a point in his life, maybe it's because the circumstances are so normal to him by now, to the point to where he's just become indifferent to the spiritual side of life. But this is not how a man of God reacts to being told no, not with violence. I've heard people who call themselves Christians and they boast, they brag about how they reacted to somebody hurting their feelings by becoming physically violent. And the worst part is that if you try to call this out, these kinds of people just don't care what you have to say. They would never say it out loud, but they don't care what the Bible has to say about Christian character. They don't care what you have to say, certainly. They might even call you judgmental. They might call you a hypocrite because you too have sinned in the past, haven't you? They pull that card out on you. But the fact is, they're on the spiral. There are two places that you can be in this Christian life. You can either be on the potter's wheel, or you can be on the spiral. Many Christians are on the spiral. Many are on the wheel. David in this season, and you can't really notice it during this whole time, except for what happens right here in verse 13, and something else that happens towards the end of the chapter. You can't really see it, but the evidence is there. And I want you to remember this moment in the weeks ahead, because you're going to see a seed that's planted actually begin to bloom. This side of David will get worse in the chapters ahead as he runs and keeps running and just keeps running. So let's look at chapter 14. Verse 14. But one of the young men told Abigail. Now that's probably one of David's own young men who runs to tell Abigail. And it probably shows us in that one little sentence how there are even men among this 600 who find this a very startling reaction by David. One of his own men, allegedly, are going to Abigail to warn her, David is sending the troop down here for your husband. If you want to do anything to stop this, this is that window of time that you need. So it continues in verse 14. One of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he railed on them. But the men were very good unto us, and we were not hurt, neither missed we anything, as long as we were conversant with them when we were in the fields. They were a wall unto us, both by night and by day, all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what you will do, for evil is determined against our master, and against all his household, for he is such a son of Belial, that a man cannot speak to him. So it's not one of David's servants, it's one of Abigail's servants warning her about this. How he knows that they're coming, I don't know. But even, you can tell that even Nabal's own servants don't have respect for him. He refers to Nabal as a son of Belial. And while there's a modern version of that, we all know that Belial was another word for the devil. So just by calling him that, we know that they don't have that positive of an opinion of Nabal. And he is telling Abigail this because it is very hard to communicate with Nabal. The idea that we have from this man is that he is such a self-righteous, my way or the highway type of guy, to the point even to where he makes stupid decisions in business. Have you ever heard the saying, you can't argue with stupid? You really can't, because all stupid people think that they're right about everything. every single thing. And Nabal's name literally means the foolish one, or it means foolishness, something like that. I mean, this man who's only said one miniature speech so far, he's just dripping with unpleasantness. So he tells Abigail, because if he goes to tell Nabal, Nabal either won't do anything or he'll just make the situation worse. So he tells Abigail, Abigail who is the wise one, Abigail who is the smart one, he tells Abigail, if you can think of a way to save this situation, please do. Please, just this is the time for you to start that. And it says in verse 18, then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 sheep ready dressed and 5 measures of parched corn and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and then laid them on donkeys. And she said unto her servants, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal. And it was so, as she rode on the donkey, that she came down by the covert of the hill. And behold, David and his men came down against her, and she met them. In other words, David is on his way to kill her husband. So it says in verse 22, now David had said, surely in vain have I kept all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertained unto him. And he has requited me evil for good. He's basically saying we've been protecting this land. Even if Nabal didn't ask for our protection, we've been protecting this land. We protected your own employees when they were out in the area that we are currently living in. And all I did was ask for a little bit of assistance, and your husband said no. A resounding, very clear, very straightforward no. Now again, you know what you do when you find yourself in this situation? You go and find another job. You don't kill the boss of the workplace that has rejected you. But in verse 22, he continues, so and more so also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave all that pertain to him by the morning light, any that pisseth against the wall. Now, as a strong statement now, it was a strong statement then. David is fuming here with rage against Nabal. Just in that little sentence between those 2 verses, he is demonstrating that he has nothing but uncensored hatred for this one man, and he is dragging his little army out to kill this one man because of his intense rage against Nabal. Who else have we been reading about who has been doing this exact thing? We can say all we want. I would never be like that. But jealousy, hatred, rage, it's incredible how low these things can take us. Verse 23, and when Abigail saw David, she hastened and lighted off the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground and fell at his feet and said, upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be. And let your handmaid, I pray you, speak in your audience and hear the words of your handmaid. Let not, my Lord, I pray you, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord, whom you did send. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, seeing the Lord has withholden you from coming to shed blood, and from avenging yourself with your own hand. Now let your enemies, and they that seek evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. And now this blessing which your handmaid has brought unto my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. As I pray you, forgive the trespass of your handmaid, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil has not been found in you all these days, all your days. Yet a man is risen to pursue you and to seek your soul, but the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord your God. And the souls of your enemies, them shall he sling out, as out of the middle of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and shall have appointed you ruler over Israel, that this shall be no grief unto you, nor offensive heart unto my Lord, either that you have shed blood causeless, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord shall have dealt well with my Lord, then remember your handmaid. It's very interesting that David's wrath is against Nabal. And here comes Abigail, who's literally done nothing wrong, offering to take Nabal's punishment completely on herself. And it's very cool because normally David is the type of Christ throughout these events. He is the giant killer. He is the reigning king. Do what? Yeah. So here we see in this chapter this woman who we just met being that type of Christ. So she says all of this to David. Don't let this fall on me, or don't let this fall on Nabal. I know that he's a son of Belial. Nabal is literally his name. Like, I don't know who Nabal is. But please do not let all of this fall on him. And then she causes David, she at least encourages David to remember the promise that God has for him. Now this is when Nabal's whole argument at the beginning of the chapter just looks even weaker, because his wife knows exactly who David is. She knows that God has promised him that he'll be the next king of Israel. So yeah, Nabal definitely knew who David, the son of Jesse, was. She says, forgive these trespasses. And then she reminds him of God's promise to him. And it says in verse 32, after she says all of this, and David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent you this day to meet me. And blessed be your advice, and blessed be you, which has kept me this day from coming to end to shed blood, and from avenging myself with my own hand. You see, the issue is that the Lord is your avenger. You are not called to avenge with your own hand. The Lord is the avenger of his people. And David forgot that here for a minute. So he says in verse 34, for in very deed as the Lord God of Israel lives, which has kept me back from hurting you, except you had hasted and come to meet me, surely there had not been left unto Nabal by the morning light any that pisseth against the wall. So David received of her hand that which she had brought him, and said unto her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have hearkened to your voice, and have accepted your person. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he held a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing, less or more, until the morning light. But it came to pass in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And it came to pass about 10 days after, that the Lord smote Nabal, that he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord, that has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept his servant from evil. For the Lord has returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head. And David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife. And when the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spoke unto her, saying, David sent us unto you to take you to him to wife. And she arose and bowed herself on her face to the earth, and said, Behold, let your handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hasted and arose, and rode upon a donkey with 5 damsels of hers that went after her. And she went after the messengers of David, and became his wife. It's very interesting, because David plotted to take matters into his own hands. But David did not know that God was already prepared to handle the situation for David. Always. In the flesh makes us understanding this so difficult, because we can be so prone to act out on our emotions. And you got to understand, David knows God. David knows that God can do anything. He knows that God can handle this. God gave him the strength over a bear, a lion, the giant. God has kept him away from Saul's wrath this entire time. God can handle a drunk fool who owns some sheep, a lot of sheep, but God can handle this. If anything, this is one of those situations where you think David would recognize, if God can do all of those great things, he can handle this situation, which is much smaller than a bear, than a lion, than a giant, than the king of Israel. This is a less serious situation. And yet David was quick to act out of the flesh instead. And had it not been for Nabal or for Abigail's intervention, Nabal not only would have died prematurely, but David would have never seen God's handiwork in this situation. If David acted out on his sin, he never would have seen God's work in the situation. How often do you think people take matters into their own hands? And because they take matters into their own hands, they prevent the better alternative of the outcome that God could have brought to them. And because they don't see God in the situation, their faith weakens and weakens and weakens. They become more dependent on themselves until eventually they're just done with it. They're done with this faith. But that's because of the flesh. We can be so quick. I'm sorry. What'd you say? Yeah. Yeah.
And I think sometimes, and I don't know why, but some days are easier than others. Oh
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Because this is David, he wanted to get to Nabal, regardless, he was going to get him and kill him.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of feel that way on days, not to kill somebody, but still to take matters in your own hands.
Yeah. And after all of this happens, David sees how God moved in this situation. He acknowledges God's handiwork in the situation. But then David takes Abigail in as a wife, which is a very odd move on David's part. Back when Moses and them were in the wilderness, God had Moses prophesy to the then future kings of Israel, specifically to them, to tell those future kings, future for his generation, that they were not allowed to have more than one wife. That was a very direct strike to the kings of Israel, who at Moses' day would rule Israel sometime from then. And that had been in the law, Moses' words that God gave him, that had been in the law ever since Moses first spoke it. It had been in the system ever since they were in the wilderness. This is hundreds of years later. It's still there. Generations have had the opportunity to remind themselves of these commands. And here we see David taking in a second wife. What in the world is going on? The man after God's own heart. He was very close to killing a man in cold blood just earlier. Now he's dishonoring God's covenant of human marriage by actively seeking a second wife. Now, on one hand, you could say that Michal is back there in the city. She's not here with David right now, at least as far as I know. She's not here. David needs a wife, so here's Abigail, who has done so much. She's been good spiritually for David. She's very intelligent, very wise. I mean, she's great. But Michal is still the other half of David. When two become one, Michal is still that other half in the eyes of God. And you would think that David would recognize this, but look at what verse 43 and 44 say. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they were also both of them his wives. So not only does he take a second wife in Abigail, he literally takes a third wife. We're led to believe almost back to back, this lady Ahinoam. And then in verse 44, it tells us, but Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Phalti, the son of Laish, which was of Galim. So David marries Abigail. We're led to believe right after he marries Ahinoam. And then, shortly after that, Saul gives Michal away from David to this other guy, who you'll only read about again one time for the rest of this book. This guy that Michal has been given to. And so, it's such a weird set of circumstances. Maybe Saul had heard that David had married another woman, and in doing so, he gave Michal's hand in marriage to another person. And did the king have the right to force a divorce in the kingdom of Israel? Probably not. I can't think of any scripture that even hints to that the idea that the king of Israel can separate two people who are married. But this is what Samuel prophesied that he would do. He'll take your spouses, he'll take your sons and your daughters, he will take your property. And here we just see Saul taking something else from David. But David will never forget about Michal. David will pursue Michal again in the future. But it is a very odd way to end this chapter, because you would think that David would be back in line with his personal holiness, with his personal, holy lifestyle that he's been exhibiting throughout this entire book, really. And yet, instead of kind of going back on track where he needs to be spiritually, he then commits a second sin. He does that sin a second time right after the first time. And then he loses his first wife, in their legal marriage and all that. All of this coming after he sins in his heart against another man to take that man's life. So what in the world is happening with David? At the end of it all, David still knows that trusting God is his best option. And all of us know this. We have this information in our mind, but because of the flesh, let me add to that. Let me amend that. Because of the leverage that we can give our flesh, trusting God for that reason can sometimes be easier said than done. Not because of the flesh itself, but because of when we lean into the flesh, when we give the flesh that leverage, when we give our flesh that authority. Whenever we do these things, then trusting God can unfortunately be easier said than done. So we're going to stop there.